What would you add, Yannis, about similarities between the Khwajagan and the Malamiyya?
Well, I think in our association together, I think in our association together over the years, we discovered a great deal of similarities. It's not only that Mohammed Parsa mentions that at one time, I correct me if I'm wrong, but he seems to say that they were once one and the same, the Malamatis and the Khwajagan.
Well, he certainly mentions the tabaqat of Sulami. And the context that he mentions is a very respectful acknowledgement that he's trying to model his own book, the Qudsiyya, upon Sulami's work, because he's explaining how you can have statements that, although they may be brief, but they're the essential teachings of certain teachers, that you can build a worthy book around that. So he mentions Sulami in that context. But we see the influence of the Malamati throughout. We see it in Naqshband's behavior from start to finish. We see it in their principles. So there's no doubt whatsoever there was a huge influence. But for those people who are sticklers on historical details, in fact, the association is scant in the Naqshbandi literature, but it is there. It is there.
Yeah, I remember in doing research, going over several times the direct quote from Mohammed Parsa, that it says in so many words, originally they were one and the same, and I think he means at the roots there was a similar impulse at work, if not the same impulse at work.
Well, that's I would be happy to look at this.
We'll take a look
text,
at that.
Yes, very good.
Right. I think that the similarities are very strong because of the influence on not the influence, but the emphasis on self-reflection, on a psychological insight, which often the Malamatis of Nishapur were later criticized for. Jami was one of the people who criticized them for being overly concerned with psychological states, rather than relinquishing themselves to something else. So we can safely say that there was a psychological reflection and insight, much of it having to do with balancing the excesses that you point out. So that there's an important emphasis placed on the balancing of intoxication and sobriety, with sobriety being maintained outwardly while a deepening of intoxication takes place inwardly. That's there too. There's also a similarity insofar as there was a critique and a de-emphasizing of external signs of piety, and also external signs of affiliation to Sufism that separated the Sufi from the normal person. This flows into the Naqshbandiyya. This was also part of the Malamatiyya, blending into the crowd and maintaining a presence in normal life and not going into long-term retreats. These are all very similar as well. And it has, again, to do with an integration over time of what we might refer to as specialized states. I don't want to say of altered consciousness, but alternative modes of consciousness that need to be brought into one's daily life and one's work in the world.
On the theme of commonalities in practice, Bob, particularly practice today, East or West, what do you find are the most important common structures in practice between these two traditions?
Well, certainly the points that Yannis has just brought up are still just as relevant today. The whole idea of blending in with the crowd is such a useful idea for the modern world, because since spirituality and the overt practice of spirituality would not exactly be greeted by everyone in any case today, it's not only a viable way to progress spiritually, in the sense that one is not trying to be special One is not trying to be standing out, which is a hazardous thing to do in any sense, but has the additional benefit of allowing us to blend and to really be part of the community that we live in, which the Sufis see and the Muslims should see, hopefully, as the new creation. Meaning in every moment the divine awareness is recreating itself and manifesting in the world, and whatever world we find ourselves in, we should be part of that world. And what could be better than blending with it? So that practice alone sets both joins the Malamatis and the Naqshbandis in practice and sets them apart from some paths which may have other great benefits but which may be lacking in this benefit, because maybe very often there are groups that want to be seen as a particular order or a particular path, and they wear special clothing and so forth. But in today's world, especially after 9/11, it would seem to me that this principle was very useful, blending into the crowd. The other point is the exercise of conscience has such a high position, starting with the Malamati tradition, and that principle is the main principle that is brought into the Naqshbandi tradition from Malamati sources, which, as I said earlier, had in fact permeated all of Persian culture. I mean, people don't realize the most important book in the Persian language, and therefore the second book after the Quran, was really Sa'di's Gulistan, that I mentioned earlier. And if you go and read this book, you will see that many of the Malamati principles have fully permeated. Just as a simple example, in the opening, Sa'di says, Ay murgh sahar, ishq ze parwana be amuz. Kan sukhta ra jan shod wa awaz nayamad. So he says, oh, you loud birds in the morning, whether it's like a rooster or just loud birds, go and learn about love from the moth. You see? Ay murgh sahar, ishq ze parwana be amuz. Because that burnt up one has given up its soul and has not let out any sound. And I mean, this is from start to finish. I am convinced that the Malamati teachings, they fully permeated all of the Persian culture, and that's why we see elements of it in many Sufi groups, not just Naqshbandi, but especially the Naqshbandis. So I think all of that poetry is valuable as a translator. I mean, that's why I translate this stuff. You look at Shabastari, you know full well because you've read it. It's full of Malamati teachings and Naqshbandi teachings, but Shabastari is neither of those. So these teachings are valuable today because they allow us to lead a normal life, a constructive life, and yet to expand the most important part of ourselves, which is our internal connection to divine awareness.
I'd like to clarify, because we're using Naqshbandi a lot. What I believe you mean is the early Naqshbandiyya, and the Naqshbandiyya that were closest to the Khwajagan.
Yeah.
Because later there's, and what's most prevalent today, as you know, is are different branches of the Naqshbandiyya that do not place an emphasis on what we're talking about. Look, I think we're facing now, today, where we live, choices which are not very attractive to me and to people I know. One choice would be a sort of postmodernist, relativist nihilism that chucks out all this, you know. Yet another approach would be a superficial New Age, hodgepodge approach, and the other would be to default in some ways to a traditionalist at best and fundamentalist at worst form of Sufism. So what I see in the potentiality of what you're talking about and what I hope to talk about more is another way, a way that avoids all three. It's neither a fundamentalist / traditionalist approach, nor simply facile New Age, an overly absorbed narcissistic approach, nor simply chucking the whole project in favor of relativism and nihilism. So I think it's extremely important that people really delve into these traditions deeply experientially and also in a scholarly way to extract the hikmat, the wisdom that still resides in these traditions. And by that I don't mean simply a metaphysical or philosophical insight. I mean actual practical work. And I think talking about what is required for practice is extremely important.
So what would you say are the essential structures of contemporary Sufi practice?
In the Naqshbandi way, as I understand it, the original principles of the Naqshbandi way, and bringing them into a viable practice for this world, the first thing would be the application of conscience and observation. So you cannot really exercise conscience properly until there's been a period of self-observation. So there's self-observation, and then the assessment coming out of that self-observation. And that leads, hopefully, to choosing certain approaches and behaviors and trying to abandon others. Now, most people think that might mean, traditionally, they might think, well, that means abandoning sin or becoming more religious. But I don't see it that way, and I don't see the original practice that way. What I understand is that part of self-observation and the application of conscience is to have a twofold approach, which one wing is the allowing of self-exploration and the plumbing into the depths of darkness as well as light within the psyche to better understand the self and to allow. And at the other wing is the wing of discipline, self-discipline, choosing certain approaches. So these together, for me, is the first aspect. The next aspect are a series of practices that involve detachment from the sensate experience, mental experience, imaginal experience, and the detachment that I'm talking about leads to an open awareness that allows one to see the reality of things. And then at that point, there is, as it turns out, with the deconstruction of not just the self but the mind, there is the experience of vastness, which is called drunkenness. So the last phase is the integration of that and the bringing it into this world and finding coherence that has a coherent expression, rather than, say, either a magical expression or a search for power, or that one's expanded awareness is abducted by the ego. In other words, the issue of integration is a huge issue. So that is how I see it in a nutshell.
I was listening carefully to what you said, and it sums up every point that we work with very nicely. So I don't know that we would add very much to what you just said. I mean, there's an emphasis in both ways on what Lale Bakhtiar, at least, has called psychoethical development. By that, I don't mean to reduce it to a psychological process. There's a recentering of the locus of one's own identity to a different place than normally. And I think with that comes the reduction of the impulse to mastery, to control in the egoistic way, and also a seeing through of what could be called the master-slave dynamic. How most of the ways that people relate are based on power, on control, on manipulation, sometimes overtly, sometimes covertly. The reduction of that impulse, the seeing through of that commanding nafs, to use the classical expression, is, I think, essential. Without that, there's the rest, expanded states and all the rest, don't count for much. So in the intoxication is the great danger also. I think in both our approaches, which come from a common source, look at this very carefully. You know, what occurs in that inflationary rush that accompanies intoxication? And how does one get one's sea legs when one begins on a daily basis to encounter that infusion of ecstasy? That's it.
So the other commonality in our traditions that is applicable today is the idea of sohbat. Sohbat means meaningful companionship, meaningful interchange, which cannot be a master-slave dynamic, as you say. And sohbat in the Naqshbandi way is considered to be as important as meditation, or zikr, or muraqabah. And in fact, the Naqshbandis have said that it's more important.
Yeah, this is another similarity.
Yeah, another similarity and a shared thing that is still applicable today, which is that despite what we've both said about Sufi practice, in fact, there is a kind of sharing that has to take place with those who are already on the path. There is a journey, it has a map, and somehow the journey has to be made in a way that honors this principle of meaningful companionship.
Thank you.